Hello and welcome to another episode of Global Ideas, an initiative by Hong Kong Baptist University to bring some of the finest minds together to help us make sense of some of the complex challenges of our times. Now, this is Global Ideas Season 2, and we are exploring the deglobalization of global media. So far, we have looked at the rise of the Western media, the role of Western media in creating certain types of narratives, and also counter to those narratives by countries like Russia with their own English language media infrastructure. We also looked at the rise of many internets and a growing emphasis on digital sovereignty. Now, if there's one country in the world which is at the forefront of this overall deglobalization trend, that is China. So the question is, how do we make sense of the deglobalization of global media in the Chinese context? To what extent has Chinese media been able to put out their own stories successfully? And of course, where is this overall trend heading? To help us understand, we are extremely delighted to have an eminent guest from China. We have with us Professor Yuezhi Zhao. Professor Zhao is Humanities Chair Professor at Tsinghua University and Professor Emeritus, School of Communication, Simon Fraser University, as well as a Fellow of Royal Society of Canada, focusing on the transcultural political economy communication and the intersections of communication, culture, and social transformations across East and West and urban and rural divides. She has written extensively in both English and Chinese on the political, economic, and socio-cultural dimensions of China's rapidly transforming communication system and the role of communication in China's global reintegration. We'll ask about it. Her English language books include Media, Market, and Democracy in China, Communication in China, Political Economy, Power and Conflict, Global Communication Towards a Transcultural Political Economy, Democratizing Global Media, One World, Many Struggles. She is also one of the co-editors of the ongoing Geopolitics of Information book series published by the University of Illinois Press. And she's also a recipient of the C. Edwin Baker Award for the Advancement of Scholarship on Media, Markets, and Democracy from the International Communication Association, ICA. Professor Zhao, welcome to Global Ideas.
Thank you. My pleasure. Yeah.
We also have with us Professor Daya Thusu. Professor Thusu is a renowned global scholar of international communication. He is widely known for his extensive publications in the field of communication. He is the founder and managing editor of the SAGE journal, Global Media and Communications. He has authored or edited 20 books, and 21st coming soon. Professor Thusu has been a distinguished visiting professor and inaugural Disney chair at Schwarzman College, Tsinghua University, Beijing, and currently teaches at Hong Kong Baptist University. Professor Thusu, welcome, sir.
Thank you.
And we have with us our colleague, Vincent Wong. Vincent is a former bureaucrat, currently doing his PhD at HKBU. He has over 2 decades of industry experience and considered a pioneer in promoting solution journalism in Asia. He has an MBA and LLB from the University of Cambridge and Imperial College in London. As usual, Vincent, it's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So let me start by asking this question to Professor Zhao. Professor Zhao, we have recorded 7 episodes of Global Ideas, and I'll start by asking you, help me. Why help me? Because after 7 episodes and talking to some of the most renowned scholars all over the world, I'm still not sure if this could be described as a period of deglobalization triggered by what some say the new Cold War. So there are 2 questions there. Has the new Cold War begun? In that, is the deglobalization, are we entering into a period of deglobalization? And in all of that, how do we make sense of this deglobalization of the global media? Is the global media facing challenge? Professor Zhao, the floor is yours.
Wow, that's a lot of questions. I don't remember, I don't think I can remember all the questions, but I do remember some of the key words you threw out to me. So let me start with at least 2 of these key words. The first is the word, the new Cold War. For some people, the argument will be yes, the old Cold War ended with the collapse of the Berlin Wall. And we enter a period of, for some, the triumphant of neoliberal globalization. But for some people, I think I'm one of those people, actually, the Cold War, if you look at from the point of view in East Asia, if you think about the division of the North-South Korea, if you think about, the tension across the Taiwan Strait, in a way, the Cold War never has ended, the old Cold War, not to mention the new Cold War. So that's one perspective. Another is, for many people, the new Cold War, if you talk about it, it's imposed by one side. I don't think, well, speaking, I'm sitting in Beijing, speaking from the people in Beijing, or at least some people among my colleagues, we don't want new Cold War, and nobody wants it from this side. So people refuse even the word, the new Cold War. And then some people will even go further. Is this a new Cold War or already the hot war? We had a hot war going on, or a war has been going on in the center of Europe. And between the US and China, you have all this technological war, trade war, and yes, you do have like actual physical attacks of Chinese computer networks by the US security agencies. Is that cold or hot? I don't know. So in that sense, I think, of course, each terminology is loaded. So if you will, yes, I will, under all these, qualifications, I understand where you come from. So the question of basically changes or dramatic changes in the global political economic order. So if you want to describe that as the new Cold War, I understand where you come from. So then the second term, deglobalization. Well, I will put it not as deglobalization. I will put it as the implosion or the collapse of neoliberal globalization, a process that started in the 80s or last century or 20th century, in the 80s, and then it accelerated with, like what I said, the end of the Fourth Berlin Wall. But that process was itself full of contradictions internally and internationally. So by 2008, with the Wall Street financial crisis, that's the beginning of the end of neoliberal globalization. But I won't call this deglobalization, because if you understand globalization as a process where different cultures, different humanizations reach out, and a process that starts way before the beginning of, not to mention, the recent wave of capitalist globalization, but, start with even the early on, the expansion of global capitalism. I think globalization in a generic terms or small g term has always going on. It's the nature, the speed, and the direction that we are talking about. So what's going on now, I think, is the collapse or the implosion of neoliberal globalization. And we're in a period of turmoil. But from there, I think there can be alternative forms of globalization and contestations for new forms of interconnectivity between countries, nations, humans, all that. So that's how I look at.
Right. So let me invite Professor Tusu. But Professor Tusu, before you ask a question, I have a question for you also, because based on the discussions that we have so far, now we have two definitions of deglobalization, right? Professor Elena says it's de-Americanization, and Professor Zhao is saying it's the collapse of neoliberal globalization. Are these essentially the same thing, or is there a difference between these two definitions? And how do you see them, Professor Tusu?
Thank you. That's a very interesting question, because as Professor Zhao said, it is a process. I mean, there is a globalization with a small g going back to the 19th century, with the expansion of capitalism, with colonialism, with integration of global markets, etc. And as Professor Zhao also mentioned, 2008 is a very important year as a disruptor of that neoliberal globalization. So I would see it as a process. You can have different names for it, but essentially what it shows is a certain version of globalization sometimes referred to as Anglo-globalization, it was weakened in 2008, but I think when we are now in 2022, one could argue that it is on the verge of collapse. It hasn't quite collapsed because it's a very, very powerful, factors behind it, a lot of, money and resources and other kind of hard power and soft power. So, but if I may, I have a sort of related question with in this field, which is about one of the great beneficiaries of this neoliberal globalization war, where countries in the global south, China obviously was and is at the top of the pyramid, as it were, or India, Brazil, other developing countries did rather well out of it, right? Opening up the markets, etc. Then it got to a stage when some of these countries, notably China, was doing things which were in some ways superior to what the original format was. So there was a discussion around the idea of a new version of globalization. Some people called it Sino-globalization. If we think of Belt and Road Initiative, for instance, which has now hundreds of countries as members. You think of organizations like BRICS, now BRICS Plus, or SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And there are many other regional kind of outfits which have created in recent years with the Chinese kind of inspiration, resources, etc. So my question to Professor Zhao is that first, whether you believe there is Sino-globalization, and two, whether that has been thwarted by this new Cold War, by this idea that it's becoming too powerful and it has to be, its wings have to be clipped. I mean, I did history, my first degree was in history. So if you go back a little bit, and think of what was happening in the 60s and early 70s about Japan, the rise of Japan, right? And at that time, the difference in terms of per capita income or GDP between Japan and the United States was much less than what is the difference between China and the United States today, because China has so many more people. So this is not something new, clipping of wings of somebody who might appear to be a rival. I mean, there's no coincidence that the European Union now describes China as a systemic rival, right? So, Professor Zhao, how do you see this whole Sino-globalization process? Was it just a little blip in this process of globalization, or is it something which is in its infancy and is going to grow and provide an alternative to the neoliberal globalization?
Wow, that's a huge question. I don't know where to start. Let me, again, since you invoke history, although I'm no historian, let me put in even longer perspective. Because in China, or inside China, there's a phase about the, great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, or that kind of thing, that talk. And if you put, we talked earlier about, the process of globalization led by the expansion of global capitalism. But if you stretch history back further, people will argue, or at least there are enough evidence to say that once upon a time, China used to be the leader in global trade. That's before the rise of the West, right? So in that sense, you can understand the current the so-called Sino-globalization within that framework. Another thing is, you mentioned about China being the beneficiary of the recent wave of globalization. But if you look at China's economic growth, or China's, the so-called China rise from an internal perspective, that development has also been uneven and with huge internal social cost. If you ask about the laid-off workers, if you ask about the emptied villages, then you will see that pattern was no longer sustainable. So the original, the idea of American-led globalization in what some call the Chimerica formation, right? China-America, in which China produced and lent money to the US, where US consumes and borrow money from China, became unsustainable. So in that sense, this uneven nature of the previous view of globalization had to be readjusted. But it's within this process that some found this a challenge from the part of China, because one view tend to put China in a place where it kept itself in at the low end of the global production chain. So you mentioned about Japan's rise, and also how that was seen as a threat to the American lead order. So to the extent that the original or the capitalist US dominate version of globalization is itself uneven, and it benefits certain nations more than others, and it kept certain nations at the end of value production. Then some people see China's attempt to climb up the global production chain or the global value chain as a threat to the current global order. So again, I feel it's important to have both global level analysis and also domestic level of analysis, and also to look beyond the superficial trend to analyze the global power structures. And so when you say China is a beneficiary of the earlier wave of neoliberal globalization, then we have to think the domestic uneven nature, and also look at the internationally, the uneven nature, because some people feel in that arrangement, actually, it's the transnational corporations who benefits more. It's the US by printing out, currency.
Just to a small addition.
Yeah.
Actually, if you look at the latest Fortune 500 list of top companies,
yes,
the largest number are in China.
Mm-hmm.
And the number has actually grown in this period of decoupling and alleged deglobalization. The number had actually grown. So it is not, so when I say that China has benefited, China would not be in that position, or Chinese companies would not be in that position if there wasn't an infrastructure in place, call it new liberals infrastructure, where this was possible. Then if you look back at Fortune 500 at the beginning of 90s, you will have to look very hard to find a single Chinese company. Today they are at the top. So something has obviously changed.
Definitely. Something has changed because Chinese companies have indeed climbed up to the global...
They're at the top.
Yes, value production chain. And that is seen as a threat to the existing US-dominated global order. Therefore, the delinking, the decoupling, the new Cold War. So to that sense, the global economic order is changing, and it's changing towards a more diversified order, and that itself threatens existing interests. And speaking of the Belt Road Initiative, yes, indeed, since its beginning, this initiative has had a huge impact in terms of the development of telecommunication, transportation, infrastructures. And it has provided an option, at least another alternative to many developing countries, or countries that had not had enough of that kind of essential infrastructure for their
let me ask you about the initiatives and telecommunications later stage, but let's also narrow down, because the globalization itself is a huge topic, as you suggested, as Professor Thusu delved in the history. But let's narrow it down to our own focus, little bit selfish. We are students of media and communication. So let's bring journalism here and media here. Vincent.
Allow me to move closer to home, like the media sector or the news industry. I think facing a globalized world whether it is the collapse of a neoliberal order or a de-Americanization or decoupling, whatever you call it, but facing the current changing order, how global is the Chinese media? How effective, or I should say how ineffective, is the Chinese media in promoting their own version of narrative, countering the basically US-led Western media narrative? How do you see that? Is Chinese media global at all at this stage?
Great question. And it depends how you see it. If you talk about technological capacity,
yes, you're right.
Technological reach or so-called coverage, Chinese media outlets, especially Chinese state-led media outlets that like CGTN, with satellite footage, all that, it's absolutely global, right? You can claim globality. There's no question about it.
Not very global.
Yeah, but if you talk about effect or to what extent it's being received all over the world, then the question becomes more complex. And what's interesting is this. Actually, just a couple of days ago, I came across a report released by Cambridge University Center for the Future of Democracy. It has some really interesting data. So what is most interesting is this. In the Western countries, or where you have about 1.2 billion people, and all the advanced Western capitalist countries, images of China or people's attitude towards China has gone very low. The figure says about 75% of the 1.2 billion people in advanced Western countries think very negatively about the Chinese. About China, and given the extent to which the Anglo-American media, i.e., the mainstream Western media, has been covering China or so negatively, I think this is not surprising. But the interesting figure is that in the rest of the world, i.e., the rest of the global South or even larger part of the non-Western world, where you have 6.3 billion people, the figure is that 70% of people were more positive. So if you talk about effective, more positive about China, it's actually China is more positive than the US among the global South. So if you ask about, but I'm using Cambridge data, okay? It's not my data. And you can check that report. So when you ask about effectiveness, I always, inside China, we always debate about this question. I will ask, among whom? If you want to talk to the Trump people, right? Then it's one question. If you want to talk about people in the global South, then maybe the image of China is more effective or more positive, especially actually this report also says the image of China is actually more positive among the Belt Road countries. So if actually China, talk about communication infrastructure, if China actually worked to build a bridge in your neighborhood, in your country, and then maybe that bridge is indeed what is needed, or that railway is what you needed, then, it's hard not to have a positive image, especially if you have been waiting for years, for US transnational capital or for domestic capital, whatever, to build that. So in answer to your question, I think how global is global Chinese media? Technically, very global. Symbolically, in terms of meaning, it depends. It depends on which part of the world, what kind of audience you are talking about. And it might be the case that those people who have positive image of China may not necessarily access either Chinese media or Western media, who knows, right? So maybe a combination of not so global media, but, local media, also maybe, by their own personal lived experiences, right? So I think this is a really complex question.
Agree.
Yeah.
I will invite Professor Tusu, but let me provoke you, Professor Zhao, a little more. So when you say that there is one part of the world where the media is reaching, but they may not be necessarily looking at China in a positive way, and there's other part of the world where the media might not be reaching, but they have a very positive view about China. Which side of the world matters in your opinion?
Which side of the world, in my opinion, it depends on which side of China I stand on. If I'm, standing for a vision of socialist China, a third world China, or historically, a China that commit to internationalism, commit to peace, development, and global justice, I'm on the side of the global South. I'm on the side of the peoples of the world. Many people probably have an image of China's Tiananmen Square, Tiananmen Gate. On Tiananmen Gate, there's a slogan which I always like, long live of the great unity of the peoples of the world. So I'm actually somebody have long advocate that the Chinese media need to defocus on preaching to those people who won't listen, who preach to the people who have an axe to grind, who try to make the demonization China their business, try to transfer their domestic class race tensions to China. And I'm always arguing, that the Chinese media should try to reach out to more people in the global South.
Right. Let me invite Professor Tusu. Thank you for that passionate argument. I just wanted to make sure that the passion continues. Professor Tusu.
Thank you. The notions of global South are also problematic. So if you look at your neighboring country, India, which is nearly 1.4 billion people, and if you ask people what their perception of China is in India, I wouldn't be surprised to say it's not very positive.
Mm-hmm.
So China is India is a very important part of the global South, right?
Yeah.
It is the fifth largest economy in the world today. So sometimes this generalization, we used to call it third world. I've been working on this field for a long time. So it is more complicated than that. The interesting question perhaps is that why is that the Chinese narrative, media narrative that is not reaching the audience it ought to reach, not just in the global South, but also in the global North, and within that the core Anglo-American world, despite of the fact that billions of dollars have been invested in China's external communication in the last 20 years. As you said, Professor Zhao, the technological investment, the infrastructure investment is phenomenal in communication around the world. I'm one of those rare foreigners who probably watches Chinese television every day, CGTN,
Mm-hmm.
because it gives me the kind of basic information about the world from a Chinese perspective in a language that I can understand. But I still feel that there isn't that kind of professionalism that would give it a kind of autonomy that the much maligned Western media has earned over a century or more. So my question to Professor Zhao, who has been in a previous avatar a journalist also, and has studied this in perhaps more detail than any other academic I know of. So why is it that the Chinese version of event is not reaching? Forget about state propaganda. I mean, what is the professional element which is missing in Chinese external communication, which is not being able to tell a very good story that China has to share with the world? It doesn't have to invent stories. The story is there. Mm-hmm. It is the storytelling skills, perhaps, which need a bit of honing and sophistication to reach a diverse global audience. What is your take on this?
Yeah, okay. I think your question, your comments want to direct me to talk more at the professional level rather than, the bigger question of the ideological level.
Sure.
So let me answer by agreeing with you first. That is, on our storytelling level, there is much room for improvement. Absolutely, I totally agree. And I always criticize the Chinese media, including state media, for being so, lost touch with the people. And it's so top down and just lack of self-confidence, but also lack of, just the ability, yes, to tell a good story. That's why, the whole Chinese nation nowadays the slogan is to try to tell a good China story, right? For example, China's anti-poverty story. You achieved one of the, in terms, in our humanity scale, it's an incredible level of achievement. Also,
unparalleled in human history.
Yes, unparalleled in human history. So the idea is that in terms of poverty reduction, in terms of environmental restoration, in terms of, education, there's so many good stories to tell. But that kind of, and also the biggest one for myself, because I came from rural China, the massive effort in rural revitalization. You won't believe how much effort is going on, how much money is pouring in, and how many just exciting stories are there. But
thanks to you, I have had the privilege to see it firsthand.
Exactly.
In your village.
You saw the village, and I took my students from Egypt all over the world to there. And guess what they are seeing? Wow, I can't believe that you can be modern, but also in the village. One student said, wow, if the Trump administration only put so much money into rural America, the situation might be different, right? So there is indeed, back to your point, there are indeed so many exciting stories to tell, but those stories either were not told properly well, or it didn't came across. And that is unfortunate. I blame the Chinese media, state media, for not doing enough, for not finding, like we will say, use the word professionalism. Maybe they are trying to be too professional, trying to be too even-handed without being able to champion this kind of story, tell them with passion. That's one thing. And then another thing I want to insist that no matter how well you tell it, you talk about the heartland of Anglo-American elites. I really don't think the heartland of Anglo-American elites are ready or are prepared to listen to a China story in a way that's not impacted by the Cold War framework, not impacted by this fascination or obsession with Chinese, state repression, all that. And that, the video exchange that I was talking about this morning was precisely about that. So my point is, yes, the Chinese media has a long way to go to tell a better story, because there are so many good stories to tell. But at the same time, it also depends on the audience, right? If they have decided that they're going to shut up their mind, if they have decided that, we are not going to take the so-called China rise easily. We want to put you down, then there's no way you can tell a good story. They will listen. So that's my insistence. And from there, I think I back a little bit different from as a Chinese compared with, because your home country, native country, India, right? I think every achievement that India makes now will come across better in the West, because India is considered as, the world's largest democracy, whereas China has always been framed in terms of the, Cold War.
I beg to differ. That's a different discussion.
Okay.
One that it is not considered, it is the largest democracy, and two, it actually gets a very bad press.
Oh, from the West as well?
From the Western world. You have to look very, very hard to find a single article in the New York Times which even has a faint praise for the current Prime Minister of India.
Okay.
One article. If you find it, email it to me.
Okay. If that's the case, then I think.
And it's not just, by the way, it's not just India or China. Look at Iran. Look at Africa more broadly. Look at the Muslim world more broadly. It's a bigger problem. Yes.
Right. So it's not.
But my concern is because China has the resources. China has the power. China has a story to tell.
Yes.
Right?
I
so
understand.
the poverty reduction story is such a powerful story for 90% of the world.
Exactly.
And one thing you didn't mention, which is crucially important, sorry, just 1 second. Unlike the guardians of freedom and liberty in the world, how many countries has China actually invaded in the last 70 years? And how many countries has United States, France, Britain, I could go on, they have invaded. So what gives their media this moral high ground? Despite their history, they are able to set the narrative.
Wow.
That is a phenomenal case of how you tell the story.
Exactly. But okay, Daya, remember, we are media scholars, we study soft power. But remember, soft power can never be separate from hard power. The US gained its power, including absolutely media power, not just because it can tell a good story, but because of its imperial history, because it bombs the world. Because if you tell your good story, they bomb you, they disconnect you. Just as China begins to tell good story, they want the Xinhua Chinese media to be registered as, state or whatever, third-party agency. Just as, they disconnect Russia today. So we are communication scholars, but do remember, we should remember that we can't just talk about soft power, telling a good story in isolation. And so I think that's very important. Another point, if, like what you're saying, you acknowledge that China has a good story, compelling story to tell. And if a country that has a compelling story to tell and has all the means to tell can't even get the message across, how do you expect other countries, right, to do that? So in that sense, I think China is on the same boat with a lot of other countries, and that we can find comfort with each other. And in believing that something is wrong with the existing Anglo-American domination of the world system, through hard power, through soft power, through all the military bases, all that. So in that, I do agree with you. And I think that's something we really need to keep in mind.
Can I have a quick follow-up? Just a quick follow-up.
Sorry.
According to Professor Zhao, if China has the money, have the hardware, have the will, how come they still cannot say a good story? Why?
Okay, let's see. Well, it's a either or. Okay, we are in a dialogue. You are willing to listen. You treat me as an equal, and then you are willing to listen. But if you do this, I don't want to hear. What do? We're political economists. Daya, there's a book which I contribute called Handbook of Political Economy and Communication. There's a chapter called The Political Economy of Ignorance. Okay, so there's the line of argument is that in the Western world, actually, in generic terms, I can be more specific, because of the bombardment or the brainwash of dominant media, the more you watch media, especially TV, the less you know. And so to the extent that there are people who don't want to listen, there are people who don't want to listen this story, then there's nothing you can do. And let me come back to this, to the idea of why China can't tell the story to the Western Anglo-American elite. Well, let's put it this way. I'm I'm in China. I'm not, you know, a card-carrying communist, but I do study Marxism. And so if you believe the Chinese system is a socialist system, or at least in some way, it try to, it accomplished this poverty reduction program, for example, is that we honor our system of serving the people. Then there are fundamental conflicts between the Chinese system and the Western system in that sense, i.e. the capitalist profit-driven system. So there are, in that sense, there are rivalries between systems. And those people who want to keep the capitalist system going, keep the monopoly profits going, how can they buy the China story? Because that means socialism is triumphant. Capitalism is, bad.
So to summarize, you're saying that, okay, you need to tell the story in a better way, but also you need an audience for that. Perhaps the audience is in the awe of the Western way of telling stories and the Western narratives, which has been there for long. Let me then gently bring you into the world of peace, because you mentioned bombardment 4 times in your previous answer. So let's shift away from that, because there's an actual war happening in Europe. We don't want in this conversation. So as a research student, it is again out of my own selfishness, as this is one of my PhD interest areas, is political communication, and you are a globally renowned scholar of that. So and slightly also related to the idea of storytelling. So as researchers we also do what could be broadly described as storytelling. So is there any difference, Professor Zhao, in the Western idea of political economy of mass media, as we know, and the political economy of mass media in countries like China? And you could answer this both, either on a theoretical level or even on a practical level. How do you imagine how do we imagine this political economy of mass media in our country's context? Can you give us any lens to see differently, or whether we have to go back to what Professor Thuso also always emphasizes, that why do we keep going to the books in 1970s and going back to the same Herman and Chomsky every time we talk about political economy of mass media? There are many more works done, or many more different contexts which need to be explored. Professor Zhao.
Okay, now it's coming to academic question, right? Yes, Diane and I were both, trained or studied in the field of political economy of communication. And that as a framework for analyzing media systems, I think it has common features. We focus on the question of control, right? What kind of social forces controls the media? We have value orientation. That is, we want to emphasize that the media should serve the majority of the people's interests. That should be, as diversing or as serving as much as you can the public interest, that kind of thing, right? So, and we're concerned about not only the role of the state, but also the role of capital in the governance of the media, that kind of thing. So in that sense, I think a political economy of communication as a framework for analysis has a lot of power. And I still, in coming back from the West, back to China, I'm still applying that framework. But there are indeed profound differences in both the media systems in, the Chinese system or the Western system. And that resonates what we discussed earlier. That is the nature of the state, right? Who dominates that state? What kind of class interest dominates that state? And what kind of power controls the media? In the West, we talk about Chomsky and Herman, all that. We talk about how capital dominates the media. In China, it's the state which claims to represent the people that has a dominant role over the media. But in China also, with the development of the internet, which actually has been very much dominated by domestic and transnational capital. So in that sense, the Chinese media system is also a mixed system, and in which state and then capital power were also both were influential. So what I have been doing, or in terms of analyzing the difference between the Chinese media system and the Western media system, is try to specify the extent to which what kind of power are influencing what kind of media message, right? So in that sense, I think the field of political economy is very interesting. And for myself, I'm trying to bring in transcultural dimension to it. That is, in applying Western-based political economy communication studies to the Chinese media, I have to be aware of, for example, what we talked earlier about the old and cold, or hot wars. Talk about uneven global order. Talk about the domestic uneven development, or divisions over urban and rural areas. All that, I think it's important to bring in those factors in analyzing the role of media in society, and in assessing the extent to which the media serves the majority of the people.
Right. So let me invite Professor Thusu, because Professor Thusu, again, the idea of telling a story is not only confined to the idea of legacy media, but we are living in this world of technology and internet. How do we see Chinese technology, Chinese internet, Professor Thusu?
Of course, China has the distinction of having the largest internet in the world, an internet which is indigenous in the sense both its hardware and software is Chinese, the platforms are Chinese. And there is, you have to look really hard to find another country apart from the United States which has that privilege. Russia to a small extent, but maybe India in the next 10 years. But as of now, they're using basically American platforms. And that's the case all around the world. So the Chinese internet offers so many possibilities, including in terms of globalization of Chinese media. And the concern that in some quarters, especially in the Western sectors, is that it's creating a new model of the internet, an authoritarian internet, if you like, as against the free and open internet. So I'm curious to find out from Professor Zhao what she thinks of this kind of bifurcation of the global cyberspace between closed and open. My sense, I don't read Mandarin, so my experience is very limited, but what I hear from my Chinese friends is that the Chinese cyberspace is sites for all kinds of conversations. The kind of conversation you don't see on the pages of China Daily or even People's Daily or on the CGTN website. And there's a lot happening there, which is actually in some ways a kind of cyber public sphere, and not just confined to China, but also integral to Chinese diaspora, which is the world's largest diaspora. So that fact itself makes it a global media project, if you know what I mean. But I would like to hear from Professor Zhao what she thinks of this sometimes kind of contrived division of internet being open and closed, and the Chinese model being globalized, also because BRI and all the infrastructure being set up, especially in the global south, for example, in parts of Africa.
Well, I think it's important, first of all, to at least make an analytical distinction between the hardware and again, like what we talked about earlier about how global is Chinese media, that kind of thing. The hardware of backbone internet, and then the actual discussion that's going on. And I want to agree with Daya that actually, based on my own personal experience, of course, early on, actually, I wrote a book about Chinese debates over the legacy media, but mostly also online. Of course, that's in the around 200, the first decade of the new century. The Chinese internet, in terms of its content, despite all the outside discussions and concerns, it's like these days outside China, if you talk about Chinese internet, then people say, oh, censorship, right? The Western media has done so much work that these two words are almost connected. If you mention about internet, you will immediately think of Chinese censorship, right? And that's the effectiveness of Western propaganda in that sense. Despite all that, actually the Chinese internet sphere is much more in terms of discussion, in terms of debate, in terms of, even the future direction of China, the world. It's very exciting, very diverse, and it's full of controversies. Of course, sometimes you got censored, but then you find another way to express, because so what I want to emphasize that the Chinese cybersphere is really, as far as I'm concerned, is very diverse and is full of discussions, okay? And much of those discussions were related to the country's fundamental issues. And some of those discussions, including exposés, outrages over some bad things, like, one of the, some kind of investigative journalism type, old fashioned, got state to respond, and things are done. Policies got changed. So in that sense, there is, as far as I'm concerned, quite a functioning public sphere going on. And it's not just, you can see whatever, and then nothing can be changed. But in the Chinese, managed, or if you will, control the public sphere, there are discussions, and then things got done. That's one thing. And I feel this is something that needs to, or the outside world needs to move beyond, like, Chinese internet censorship. Need to think that actually there is substantive debate going on. And furthermore, that debate fits into public policy. And so there's positive role of state response, rather than, you can see whatever in some, other countries, but it might not have actual policy or results. And I do want to emphasize the second part as well. That's, I guess, the benefit of a state-managed public sphere, right? Because whatever is said or allowed to be said, the state got to respond. Right? So that's the second point. Another point, you said earlier, whether people might worry, because if you connect the Chinese internet with censorship immediately, or manage the controlled authoritarian model, then you worry about, if the Chinese model got expanded through the Belt Road and into the rest of the world, that's, the doom of the world's freedom of speech, that kind of thing. I think it's a bit paranoid, because what the Chinese state tried to do, and you said earlier, China has been the exception that in its own some way, has its own managed cyberspace, whereas many other countries couldn't do that, because the Chinese state is no other state. It was tough. It's forged in revolution. It knows the idea, talk about political economy. I think, the Chinese state had this idea of, this cultural swing. Remember Dallas Smith? He visited China in the 70s, and he said that, if you all want to build socialism, you got to overcome the Western accusation of not having press freedom. You got to set up your own cultural swing to decide your own national development path. So I think the Chinese state has been able to do that in some ways. And so, nowadays, if other countries try to make use of Chinese technologies to build their own backbone, or to expand their cyberspace, then it's important for those countries to try their best to maintain a national control, if not, in a good sense, not like bad sense of control, okay? Maintain a national governance of your own public sphere, including especially your cybersphere, so that you will have some autonomy in discussion for your national affairs, rather than let transnational capital come in and say, hey, let's start a revolution. That's, the lessons of Arabic Spring, yes, there are positive lessons, but also I think the negative experience of that are all too fresh. So that's what I would have to say.
With your last comment again, Professor Zhao, you have, I would say that you have tapped into a topic for which we need like days for discussion, this platform governance. And we have 3 minutes, so we will move on to the last question, Vincent.
Yeah.
I think going back to where we started, right? We talk about deglobalization, and then we talk about it's not really deglobalization, but how you define it. And then what happens to the global media? The last question I think we should all think about, if more and more people are doing this, even within the United States, like after the midterm, we still see more people were doing this, right? If people are not listening to each other,
right?
What will be called, or what will the global media, in a genuine sense, could be called? I mean, the East and the West, they're not listening to each other within the neoliberal order. People have different views. How do you see the term or the phrase global media a decade from now?
Yeah, well, I'm not a good predictor of the future, but I do want to, as a way to go back, because the reason people does this, or the so-called post-truth era, is because has nothing to, well, yes, it's a symptom in the communication sphere, but I think the roots goes back to what we said earlier about the collapse of neoliberal globalization, because that neoliberal globalization created inequality. It made some people totally disenfranchised. And those people who, especially in the West, if you talk about, the people in the Rust Belt, or that, or what, Hillary Clinton once called, basket of losers, right? Those people just were not beneficiaries of globalization, even if U.S. transnational capital or certain sectors of capital were huge beneficiaries, right? Or even if, yes, the Chinese multinational corporations or China's middle class were riding the wave of globalization. So the reason for more people to do not want to believe in mainstream media, yes, New York Times included, and for people want to believe hearsay or rumors, is because they were disillusioned in the current global order. And so the roots question goes beyond just, what kind of global media we have. We have to think what kind of global order we have, how each country is going to address your own domestic power inequality, solve your own problem of poverty, and then, yes, of course, global warming, all that kind of thing. So I would think what kind of global media we have will very much constitutive, or will be constituted by what kind of global order we have. If we're going to have wars, then you're going to have bombardment. You don't like that term, of media linkages. Oh, we already have, bombardment of, gas pipes, right? So to imagine global media alone is not enough. And let me put bluntly, I'm glad that you talk about you brought in earlier on. You said, Eleanor, talk about the de-Americanization, right? When we talk about deglobalization, because the global order has been dominated by a U.S.-led, global capitalist system, and theorists have long predicted or argued that how the U.S. will manage its hegemonic decline is a tremendous question. Will it manage it by, peaceful means, or will it bring down the world in fire? It really is upon the U.S. elites that you won't listen to the China story. Of course, the story of many other people in the world. Even if other people's story, other nations might not, like Dial might think, or like I would say, as a compelling so-called successful story to tell, they also have their own struggles, their own inspirations, and their voice got lost. So if global order or in the current reconfiguration of global order cannot address the inspirations of people. There are people who are still hungry. And if you cannot listen to the outcries of those people, then, we won't have a global media to talk about.
I don't have any problem with the term bombardment as long as it is the bombardment of ideas. And that is our effort through this series called Global Ideas. And Professor Zhao, you rightfully insisted that people are not listening to each other. So through this series, we are asking people, requesting people that listen more, watch Global Ideas. That's all we have in this episode, but we'll be back with more. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.